In the summer of 1942, the Eastern Front shifted from a struggle for space into a struggle for transport lines and industrial nodes. After the Soviet defeats in the south during May and June, Germany launched Case Blue to reach the lower Don, the Volga, and the Caucasus oil regions. Stalingrad mattered within that design not only as an industrial city, but as a rail and river junction. Control of the Volga corridor could disrupt Soviet movement between central Russia and the Caucasus, while anchoring the northern flank of the deeper advance. For the Soviet leadership, Stalingrad became a test of whether a defensive line could be stabilized in time to rebuild reserves. On July 12, 1942, Stavka created the Stalingrad Front to defend the Great Bend of the Don and prepare for the approach of the German Sixth Army. The new command structure reflected both urgency and uncertainty. Headquarters and armies were reorganized while retreating, and responsibility for the Stalingrad sector was later split when the Southeastern Front was formed on August 5th under Andrei Yeryomenko, with Nikita Khrushchev on the military council. This political military backdrop mattered because Soviet operational behavior in August and September was shaped by two simultaneous pressures. The first was material. German formations approaching Stalingrad had substantial combat power, with Sixth Army on the Stalingrad axis, numbering more than 300,000 men when it neared the city area in August. The second was institutional. On 28 July, Stalin issued Order No. 227, demanding that withdrawals stop and insisting on tighter discipline and active resistance. The order did not prescribe specific operations north of Stalingrad, but it reinforced a climate in which commanders were expected to contest ground and demonstrate offensive intent, even while improvising defenses. By late August, the geography north of Stalingrad converted these pressures into a specific operational dilemma. Early on 23 August, the German 16th Panzer Division spearheaded an advance from the Don bridgehead toward the Volga and reached the northern outskirts near Rhynok and Spartanovka, placing German armour on the riverline and interrupting movement along the approaches to the city. In early September, German attacks worked to secure and widen the connection between these forward elements and the main Sixth Army, establishing a more reliable corridor to the Volga-facing forces. For Soviet planners, this corridor created a problem that could not be solved inside the city alone. If German forces could hold the strip linking the Don bridgeheads to the Volga, they could threaten the northern approaches to Stalingrad, force Soviet reinforcements to move under fire, and shape the conditions for the main assault into the urban area. The most direct Soviet counter was to attack from the open steppe north and northwest of Stalingrad, around Kotluban and adjacent rail stops, aiming to cut the corridor, reopen operational depth for Soviet maneuver, and reduce pressure on the 62nd Army inside the city sector. This is where the forgotten relief attempts begin. Between late August and into September 1942, the Stalingrad Front launched 4 successive offensives in the Kotluban region, repeated assaults intended to rupture the German defensive belt protecting the corridor. Newly organized formations, including the 1st Guards Army, formed on August 6th from the 2nd Reserve Army, and the reformed 24th Army, created on September 1st from the 9th Reserve Army, became central instruments of these efforts. Each operation sought in different ways to force a decision on the northern flank, while the main battle for Stalingrad itself intensified. On 23 August 1942, the German advance reached a new phase when mobile elements struck through the northern approaches to Stalingrad and reached the Volga line north of the city, creating a forward German presence on the river and forcing Soviet movement into narrower corridors. The shock in Soviet command channels was immediate. That same day, evacuations began for civilians not tied to war industries, and within 2 days, a state of siege was declared in the city area. For the German Sixth Army, the operational logic was to convert speed into a stable connection between forward armour on the Volga and the main body west of the river bend, so that later assaults into Stalingrad could be supported by a secured northern flank and reliable supply routes. For Soviet planners, the same development produced a hard geometry. If the German corridor between the Don approaches and the Volga north of Stalingrad solidified, then reinforcing the city and maneuvering reserves would increasingly depend on exposed routes and contested crossings. At the command level, this opening phase combined rapid reassignments with urgent orders. Colonel General Vasily Gordov commanded the Stalingrad front during the critical transition from July into September, while Andrei Yeryomenko, appointed to lead the southeastern front on August 1st, carried responsibility for the direct defense of Stalingrad. As German forces closed, Soviet higher headquarters pressed for immediate counteraction, issuing directives that emphasize concentrated air power, continuous pressure day and night, and the expectation that available strength could eliminate forward enemy groupings. Stavka also reinforced its field control. In late August, Georgy Zhukov was elevated to Deputy Commander-in-Chief and dispatched as a senior Stavka representative to the Stalingrad sector, reflecting the degree to which Soviet leadership treated the situation as requiring central coordination beyond the normal front headquarters. This did not eliminate friction. It added another layer of authority operating alongside front and army commanders at a moment when units were arriving, reorganizing, and taking positions under air attack. By September 3, 1942, the Stalingrad front order of battle north and northwest of the city included the 1st Guards Army, 4th Tank Army, 21st Army, 24th Army, 63rd Army, and 66th Army, indicating how much combat power was being assembled on the northern approaches, even as Stalingrad itself moved towards street fighting. In this sector, the Soviet concept was not a single blow, but repeated attempts to rupture the German defensive belt in the Kotluban area and disrupt the corridor linking German forward elements near the Volga to their supporting forces. The opening moves toward Kotluban therefore began under conditions that were operationally unfavorable for rapid Soviet success. The terrain north of Stalingrad offered wide fields of fire with limited cover. German forces, anticipating counterstrokes, developed a defense organized around infantry divisions, attached engineer elements, anti-tank weapons, and controlled artillery and air support. German accounts, and later reconstructions, place key defending formations under 6th Army structures such as 8th Army Corps, while mobile elements of 14th Panzer Corps operated in the broader northern sector, a combination designed to absorb attacks and restore lines after local penetrations. On the Soviet side, key attacking forces for this opening phase included the 24th Army, commanded in this period by Major General Dmitry Kozlov, and the 66th Army, whose command changed rapidly in August before Rodion Malinovsky took over on 27th August. The 1st Guards Army, formed from reserve forces in August and commanded during August-October by Kirill Moskalenko, represented an effort to field a higher quality formation for decisive tasks. But it entered battle in a sector where German defences, air power, and the time pressure of events in the city constrained preparation. One of the first clearly documented thrusts in this sequence occurred on September 5th, when the Soviet 24th and 66th Armies organized an attack against elements associated with 14th Panzer Corps. Contemporary summaries describe the assault as collapsing within hours under concentrated Luftwaffe action against Soviet artillery and forward positions. Around 120 Soviet tanks were committed, and 30 were reported lost to air attack before the Soviet forces withdrew by midday. In German perspective, these engagements were part of the effort to prevent a Soviet cut across the corridor. In Soviet perspective, they were an attempt to force German armoured assets away from the city approaches and reopen operational space north of Stalingrad. The timing of these northern attacks intersected with a decisive change inside the city sector. On September 11th, Vasily Chukov assumed command of the 62nd Army, which would bear the main burden of the urban defence. From this point, the northern battlefield and the city battlefield became linked in Soviet planning. Pressure at Kotluban was expected to affect the balance of German forces available for the assault into Stalingrad, while developments in the city shaped how urgently the northern armies were ordered to attack. By early September 1942, Soviet planning north of Stalingrad treated time as a measurable constraint. The 62nd Army inside the city sector depended on crossings and river traffic that were increasingly exposed to air attack and artillery observation, so Stavka framed the northern counterstrokes as a way to change the operational geometry. If the German corridor to the Volga could be severed or even narrowed, the pressure on the city approaches and the river supply route could be reduced without requiring an immediate breakthrough inside the urban area. The Soviet objective at Kotluban was therefore operational rather than territorial. The target area lay roughly 40 kilometers north of Stalingrad, where German forces held a fortified belt covering the corridor linking forward elements near the Volga back toward the main 6th Army positions. Soviet plans aimed to drive a wedge through this belt, then exploit laterally toward the river-facing German group to isolate it, while simultaneously compelling German command to divert armoured and air assets away from the city assault axis. On the German side, the corresponding goal was to prevent precisely that kind of operational cut. 6th Army planning prioritised keeping the corridor continuous and widening it enough to sustain movement, supplies and relief traffic, while holding the outer flanks against repeated Soviet attacks from the steppe. In practice, this meant accepting intense fighting north of the city as the price of maintaining contact between core elements, rather than concentrating all forces directly on Stalingrad itself. These opposing goals shaped how each side allocated resources. Soviet commanders assembled assault groupings built around rifle divisions supported by tanks and massed artillery, with the expectation that a short, concentrated strike could rupture the defence line before German reserves and air power could react. German defenders, operating under corps-level control, built a defence in depth. Strong points anchored on key elevations and tracks, anti-tank guns positioned to create overlapping engagement zones, and artillery fires planned to break up Soviet infantry-tank coordination at the line of departure and in the first kilometres of advance. Logistics constrained both plans in different ways. Soviet northern armies were fighting at the end of long road and rail legs that ran east of the Don Bend, with limited motor transport and repeated interruptions from airstrikes. Ammunition expenditure in preparatory bombardments competed directly with daily needs for defensive fire around Stalingrad, while tank units required fuel and recovery assets that were scarce in the forward zone. German logistics depended on holding crossings and road nodes that connected back to the Don railheads, and on keeping enough tactical air power available to compensate for thin infantry density on exposed flanks. A key Soviet miscalculation lay in the assumed balance between speed and coordination. Several attacking formations had been recently formed or reorganized, which reduced staff familiarity with subordinate units and complicated artillery planning, engineer support, and communications under fire. The plan required synchronized infantry, armor, sappers, and artillery to defeat prepared anti-tank defenses. In practice, any delay or loss of radio links risked turning the attack into separate, sequential pushes that German defenders could defeat in detail. Another planning problem was the air situation. Soviet counterstrokes depended on artillery and tank concentrations that were visible from the air on open terrain. German operational practice in this sector treated air support as an integral component of ground defence, with dive bomber and fighter units tasked to strike artillery positions, assembly areas, and armoured spearheads during the opening hours of an offensive. Soviet planners anticipated losses, but repeated attacks meant that even acceptable attrition rapidly depleted the limited pool of serviceable tanks and trained crews available for renewed attempts. Persistence, despite failure, was built into the political and operational logic. From Stavka's perspective, Even an unsuccessful thrust could still force the German command to commit aircraft, armour, and artillery north of the city, limiting what could be concentrated for the main assault into Stalingrad. From the tactical perspective of the attacking armies, however, each new offensive began with diminished strength and reduced surprise, because German defences learned patterns of Soviet preparation and adjusted fire plans and reserve locations accordingly. This mismatch between tactical cost and operational intent became a defining feature of the Kotluban cycle that followed. The first clashes north of Stalingrad grew out of the same event that changed the battle inside the city. The German thrust to the Volga on August 23rd created a narrow but continuous operational connection between forward units on the river and the main 6th Army grouping to the west. From that point, Soviet attacks in the Kotluban sector were designed to cut this connection rather than to take Stalingrad by maneuver. The opening engagements began while both sides were still assembling. Soviet armies north of the city were under pressure to attack with incomplete reconnaissance and uneven coordination between rifle divisions, tank brigades, and artillery groups. German defenders, by contrast, were already transitioning from pursuit to positional defense. Minefields were expanded, anti-tank guns were sighted to cover likely tank approaches, and infantry strongpoints were tied into artillery fire plans that could be shifted rapidly along the corridor. Late August saw the first concentrated Soviet attempts to force a breach in the Kotluban belt. These early actions typically followed a similar pattern. Soviet artillery tried to suppress German forward positions, then infantry advanced on broad fronts with tanks committed to punch through at selected points. In open steppe terrain, however, the attack formations were exposed during the approach and became vulnerable to pre-registered artillery and airstrikes. When Soviet tank elements moved ahead of infantry to maintain momentum, they tended to meet anti-tank gun lines and mines without enough engineer clearance capacity to keep multiple lanes open. When infantry slowed under fire, tanks became isolated targets. German local responses emphasized restoring the line rather than holding every meter. Where Soviet units achieved a shallow penetration, German reserves, often mobile infantry and attached armour, counterattacked to seal the break, while artillery and Luftwaffe strikes focused on Soviet assembly areas and gun positions to prevent a second wave from exploiting. This produced a recurring outcome: short-lived advances measured in kilometres, followed by a restabilised front, with both sides reporting heavy losses in battalion and brigade-level actions. The first clearly recorded large-scale engagement in this sequence occurred on September 5th, when Soviet attacks by the 24th and 66th Armies were directed against the German defensive zone associated with 14th Panzer Corps. Soviet forces committed tanks in support of the assault, but German air power and artillery concentrated on the tank groupings and on Soviet artillery positions. The attack failed to create a sustained breach, and the front line returned to a fortified stalemate by the end of the day, setting the conditions for renewed attempts rather than a decisive operational shift. These engagements also had immediate effects beyond the Kotluban fields. For the German command, every Soviet thrust required forces to be held or moved north to protect the corridor, limiting how far units could be concentrated for the assault into Stalingrad at any single moment. For the Soviet command, the cost was cumulative. Each unsuccessful attack reduced the pool of trained infantry, serviceable tanks, and forward artillery ammunition stocks available for the next attempt, while the German defensive system grew denser and more precisely calibrated to the terrain. Inside Stalingrad, the relationship between the battles was understood in practical terms. Reinforcement and supply of the 62nd Army depended on keeping river traffic functioning under air attack and on maintaining enough operational depth on the northern approaches to prevent German forces from fully controlling the crossings and landing sites. The early Kotluban clashes did not achieve a breakthrough, but they formed the first iteration of a cycle in which Soviet command sought operational relief for the city through repeated assaults against a fortified corridor that the German command treated as non-negotiable. As September progressed, the Kotluban sector turned into a recurring crisis of force generation. The first Soviet attacks had not cut the corridor, yet the operational problem remained. German forces on the Volga north of Stalingrad still constrained Soviet movement and threatened the northern approaches to the city. Stavka therefore treated the northern armies not as a single-use striking force, but as a mechanism for repeated pressure. Each new attempt began with orders to renew the offensive quickly, even as units were still reconstituting from earlier losses. This escalation produced a shift in how both sides fought. Soviet commanders increased artillery preparation and committed more tanks to achieve a breakthrough in the first hours, because experience suggested that any delay allowed German defenders to concentrate fires and counterattack. German defenders responded by strengthening depth, expanding minefields, improving anti-tank gun positioning, and establishing predictable counterattack groupings that could move along the corridor to seal penetrations. The result was a cycle in which Soviet formations became more dependent on concentration and speed, while German formations became more dependent on prepared fire plans and rapid local reserve movement. Reinforcement decisions were made under competing pressures. Soviet reserves arriving north of Stalingrad had to be split between immediate offensive needs and the requirement to sustain the 62nd Army in the city sector with replacements, ammunition, and food across the Volga. Tank units were particularly sensitive. Mechanical losses, fuel shortages, and limited recovery capacity meant that an armoured grouping could lose combat effectiveness even without being destroyed, simply by accumulating damaged vehicles that could not be repaired close to the front. Infantry formations faced a parallel constraint, with battalions needing replacements and commanders trying to maintain cohesion after repeated attacks in open terrain. Command friction increased as losses mounted. Army staffs were often managing newly arrived divisions and brigades with limited time for reconnaissance and coordination rehearsals. Communications were vulnerable to artillery fire, air attack, and simple overload. The tempo of renewed offensives compressed planning cycles, and the attack frontage sometimes exceeded what available radios and wire lines could reliably support. Under these conditions, Soviet attacks frequently degraded into sequential pushes rather than a single coordinated rupture, making it easier for German defenders to concentrate fires and counterattack isolated penetrations. The German side also faced escalating demands. Maintaining the corridor required infantry density on exposed flanks and continuous artillery ammunition expenditure to break up Soviet attack formations. Air support became a structural component of defense. Aircraft were used not only against tanks at the front, but against Soviet artillery positions, supply columns, and assembly areas to disrupt the second and third waves of an offensive. This commitment north of the city competed with German requirements inside Stalingrad, where street fighting was developing, and where German units also needed air and artillery support. The corridor defense therefore imposed a persistent allocation problem rather than a single decisive battle. For soldiers on both sides, the crisis was experienced as repetition under tightening constraints. Soviet troops were ordered forward across similar ground against defences that had been improved since the previous attack. German troops faced repeated assaults that tested endurance and forced continuous repair of trenches, wire and mine belts. Medical evacuation and ammunition delivery became defining practical concerns. The ability to move wounded and bring forward shells, mines and fuel often mattered as much as tactical intent. At the political level, the logic of persistence was explicit. Soviet leadership required visible offensive action during a period when Stalingrad itself was under direct assault, and when Order Number 227 framed retreat as unacceptable. From Stavka's perspective, even limited advances north of the city could compel the German command to hold forces in the corridor defense, thereby reducing the weight available for the main assault into Stalingrad. From the tactical perspective at Kotluban, however, each renewed offensive began with reduced strength and increased German preparedness, turning the sector into a contest where operational necessity drove repetition despite worsening local conditions. By mid-September 1942, the fighting north of Stalingrad reached its maximum intensity, not because the terrain changed, but because the stakes and the tempo did. Inside the city, German forces shifted from probing attacks to sustained assaults into central districts and the workers' settlements. For Soviet command, this narrowed the window in which a northern breakthrough could alter the balance, before the urban battle became an attritional contest of ferry crossings, ruined buildings, and short-range fire. The Kotluban sector was therefore treated as an operational lever to force German redeployments away from the city. After the earlier attacks stalled around 5 to 13 September, Soviet forces regrouped and reinforced. The 1st Guards Army and 24th Army were positioned as the principal striking elements, supported by the 66th Army on adjacent axes. The renewed plan emphasized shock groups, rifle divisions concentrated on narrow frontages with attached tanks, and intensified artillery support, aiming to punch through the German defensive belt rather than erode it gradually. This method reflected a practical conclusion from earlier failures. A wide front advance in open steppe allowed German artillery and anti-tank fires to defeat assaults in separated segments. The peak offensive began on September 18th. Soviet 1st Guards and 24th Armies attacked the German 8th Army Corps positions in the Kotluban corridor. The German defense relied on a combination of prepared strongpoints, anti-tank belts, and immediate air intervention. Luftwaffe support was tasked to strike Soviet artillery positions and armoured spearheads during the opening hours. In one widely cited reconstruction of the first morning, 106 Soviet tanks were reported knocked out, with German Ju-87 dive bombers credited with a substantial portion of the kills, while escort fighters claimed large numbers of Soviet aircraft in the same time window. Operationally, the outcome was decisive. The assault did not produce a sustained breach, and the front line remained continuous. The cost of this peak phase accumulated rapidly because the offensive was renewed across multiple days and with limited operational depth to absorb losses. In some estimates, the 1st Guards Army incurred about 36,000 casualties over 2 days during the mid-September fighting, while supporting armies in the sector suffered additional losses measured in tens of thousands over the subsequent attacks. Even allowing for variation among sources and counting methods, the pattern is consistent. The repeated attempts consumed rifle strength faster than replacements could restore cohesion, while tank losses reduced the ability to generate a fresh armoured concentration for exploitation. On the ground, the most intense fighting clustered around named hills, gullies and riverbeds that became reference points in both sides' fire plans. Soviet shock groupings could assemble roughly division-strength forces on an 8-kilometre sector, but their advance lanes were predictable, shallow draws and approaches that could support movement under limited cover. German defenders responded by anchoring 2 regiment-level blocks with anti-tank guns and mines, backed by small mobile reserves and tanks positioned to counterattack into any penetration. In one documented sector, a Soviet shock group of roughly 18,000 men, supported by a small number of infantry support tanks, faced approximately 5,000 German troops backed by 30 to 40 tanks. The imbalance in manpower did not translate into a breakthrough because firepower density, obstacles, and air support shaped outcomes more than headcounts. A third offensive effort followed on September 23rd after another Soviet regrouping, shifting remnants and fresh units between the 66th and 24th Armies to find a weaker seam. Attacks again failed to rupture the corridor. Losses continued to rise in short, repeated cycles. Artillery preparation, infantry advance, tank commitment, then German counterfire and counterattacks to restore the line. For German command, the priority remained to keep the corridor intact, even if this required holding substantial strength outside the city. For Soviet command, the logic of persistence remained operational. Each renewed thrust was expected to pin German forces north of Stalingrad and reduce the weight available for assaults inside the city, even when local gains were limited and temporary. After the mid-September peak, both sides adapted in ways that were visible less in grand maneuvers than in how they tried to survive and function under repetition. The Kotluban fighting did not end after a single failed breakthrough. It became a sequence of renewed assaults, counterattacks, and positional repair work, where the central question for commanders was how to keep units capable of fighting again within days. Soviet adaptation began with the recognition that open-steppe assaults were being stopped before they reached German depth. Rifle units increasingly relied on engineers to cut lanes through mine belts and wire, but engineer losses and shortages of explosives and mine detectors limited how many safe corridors could be opened. Where lanes were created, they became predictable axes for German artillery, which forced Soviet planners to shift toward multiple small breaches, rather than one clearly marked main effort. This dispersed effort, however, reduced the ability to mass armor and exploit. Artillery practice also evolved under constraint. Soviet armies tried to compensate for reduced tactical surprise by expanding preparatory fires and using short, intense bombardments designed to suppress anti-tank guns at the moment tanks crossed the start line. Ammunition limits and disrupted transport meant that these plans were often scaled to what could physically be delivered forward, not to what staffs requested. In some sectors, rocket artillery was used to saturate known strongpoints and assembly areas, but without immediate infantry and engineer follow-through, the effect tended to be temporary suppression rather than permanent neutralization of defensive systems. On the ground, infantry tactics shifted toward night movement, infiltration in shallow draws, and the use of small assault groups to seize local features that could serve as artillery observation points. These methods sometimes reduced losses from air attack during approach, but they introduced new problems, maintaining unit cohesion in darkness, coordinating tank support on unfamiliar routes, and preventing friendly fire when lines changed by a few hundred meters in the same night. The result was incremental adaptation rather than a clean doctrinal change, shaped by what exhausted formations could execute. German adaptation was equally practical. Defensive belts were reinforced not only with additional mines and wire, but with better mapping of Soviet approach routes and more disciplined fire control. Anti-tank guns were re-sighted after each Soviet attempt to cover the lanes that engineers had opened previously, and infantry strongpoints were adjusted to survive bombardment and then re-emerge to engage advancing riflemen at close range. German local reserves were organized to counterattack quickly, not necessarily to regain all lost ground, but to restore a continuous line and deny Soviet forces time to consolidate. Air-ground coordination was treated as a decisive tool. When Soviet forces concentrated tanks and artillery for another attempt, German aircraft aimed to disrupt the attack before it became an infantry tank combined thrust. This reinforced a pattern Soviet commanders could not fully escape. The more they concentrated to achieve a breakthrough, the more visible the concentration became. The more they dispersed to reduce visibility, the less striking power they could generate. For soldiers, adaptation meant improvisation under attrition. Soviet units rotated companies forward with reduced strength, forming composite battalions from survivors and replacements who had not trained together. German units did similar consolidation, combining depleted companies, pulling specialists into rifle roles, and relying on field fortification work as a routine combat task. Medical evacuation and recovery became tactical factors. The ability to move wounded out and retrieve damaged tanks often determined whether a unit's losses were temporary or permanent. Morale fluctuated in ways that reflected the environment rather than ideology. Soviet troops experienced repeated orders to attack prepared defences with limited cover, while German troops endured continuous assaults and artillery fire with little operational depth behind them. Both sides measured success in immediate, tangible terms, whether a position could be held through the next day, whether ammunition arrived, whether communications worked, whether a counterattack restored the line. By late September, these adaptations did not change the central fact that the corridor north of Stalingrad remained intact. What they changed was the character of the fighting, a transition from hopes of a rapid operational rupture to a pattern of constrained methods aimed at achieving local gains, pinning enemy forces, and sustaining the capacity to fight again, because the strategic pressure from Stalingrad ensured that the Kotluban sector would not be allowed to fall quiet. The turning point in the Kotluban cycle was not a single captured hill or a named position. It was the moment Soviet and German commands reached opposite conclusions from the same evidence. The corridor north of Stalingrad could be held by Germany at acceptable cost, and it could not be cut by the Soviet northern armies quickly enough to change the immediate course of the city battle. By late September, the sequence of 4 offensives had produced a stable pattern. Soviet attacks created local penetrations, then stalled under artillery, anti-tank belts, and airstrikes. German reserves sealed the breaks and restored continuity. Soviet losses accumulated across repeated starts, often resetting the offensive line back to prepared German positions. Total Soviet casualties across the Kotluban operations are commonly estimated at roughly 80,000 killed, wounded, and missing, with tank losses concentrated in the periods of renewed armoured commitment. German losses were lower in most reconstructions, but still significant in infantry and artillery units tasked with continuous defence and counterattack, and in aircraft and armoured vehicles used to blunt repeated assaults. For Soviet command, the critical change was how the northern attacks were now weighed against longer-term operational requirements. The 62nd Army inside Stalingrad had moved into a system of close defence, relying on small footholds and constant reinforcement across the Volga. At the same time, Stavka needed to preserve formations that could later be used in a broader counter-offensive on the Don flanks. As the Kotluban assaults failed to achieve a corridor cut, the cost-benefit calculation shifted. Each renewed attempt consumed rifle strength, tanks, and artillery ammunition without producing operational freedom. The practical outcome was a gradual reduction in the scale and frequency of northern offensive efforts, even if orders continued to demand pressure. For German command, the same stabilization enabled a different decision. Holding the corridor meant that 6th Army could continue feeding forces into the city battle while keeping a defensive structure north of Stalingrad that was resilient against renewed Soviet thrusts. German forces did not need to expand rapidly northward. They needed to prevent a Soviet cut and maintain lateral mobility for reserves. Once this was achieved, German operational focus could increasingly prioritize urban objectives and the elimination of Soviet bridgeheads inside Stalingrad, while accepting that the northern flank would remain a contested, resource-consuming sector. The battlefield itself reflected the turning point. In the Kotluban area, villages, rail stops, and shelter belts were progressively erased by artillery fire, and minefields expanded in depth after each attack. Civilians who had not evacuated earlier faced requisition of food and transport, destruction of housing used as strongpoints, and the long-term hazard of unexploded ordnance and mines that remained after lines shifted by small distances. In the rear areas, both armies imposed tighter control over movement and labour to sustain road repairs, trench construction, and ammunition handling. At the tactical level, neither side experienced the turning point as a strategic choice. Soviet units saw it as repeated orders to attack with diminished battalions and improvised assault groups. German units experienced it as continuous defense work, punctuated by short, violent assaults and immediate counterattacks to restore the line. The change was visible in what stopped happening. The expectation of a decisive rupture in the corridor faded, replaced by a system of managed pressure and containment. By the end of September, the Kotluban battles had not relieved Stalingrad in the way Soviet planners initially intended. Their significance shifted toward what they had indirectly shaped: the allocation of German forces to hold the corridor and the Soviet recognition that the decisive solution would not come from repeated frontal assaults in the steppe, but from a broader operational design that would target the flanks and the supply structure of Sixth Army beyond the city perimeter. By the end of September 1942, the sequence of Kotluban offensives tapered from major breakthrough attempts into shorter, more limited attacks and positional fighting. The immediate reason was operational exhaustion. Rifle divisions that had begun the month with near-authorized strength were reduced to composite battalions. Tank units that had been committed repeatedly could no longer field enough serviceable vehicles to sustain another concentrated penetration attempt. Artillery stocks and transport capacity became binding constraints. Even when higher headquarters demanded renewed pressure, the practical ability to mass shells and fuel at the start line diminished. Soviet headquarters began to shift emphasis from immediate rupture towards stabilization and reconstitution. The northern armies still maintained contact and conducted local actions, reconnaissance in force, raids, and limited attacks to improve lines or regain observation points. But these did not seek the earlier operational objective of cutting the corridor in a single blow. Units rotated where possible, with replacements and newly arrived drafts used to rebuild minimum combat capability. Engineer activity became as important as maneuver, expanding trench networks, clearing and laying mines, preparing covered routes for movement, and improving command posts and communications under continued air and artillery threat. German forces also adjusted after the peak fighting. Having held the corridor through the heaviest Soviet assaults, German command treated the sector as a defensive obligation that had to be sustained with predictable routines: minefield maintenance, forward observation, counter-battery work, and planned counterattacks to restore the line after local penetrations. Infantry density remained limited relative to frontage, so the defence continued to rely on firepower, obstacles, and rapid local reserve movement. The corridor's function now was less about further expansion and more about guaranteeing lateral mobility and supply continuity, while the main effort remained the fight inside Stalingrad. The end state of the Kotluban operations was therefore not a clear withdrawal in the traditional sense, but a transition from offensive cycles to an attritional holding posture. On the Soviet side, the northern armies retained their general positions north and northwest of the city, but no longer possessed the concentrated striking power required for repeated large-scale assaults without a pause for rebuilding. On the German side, the corridor remained intact, yet it absorbed forces that could not be fully committed to the urban battle, because a renewed Soviet breakthrough attempt, however unlikely, still carried operational risk. Immediate consequences were measurable in organization and capability. Soviet formations were reorganized to compensate for depleted manpower. Companies merged, battalions consolidated, staffs reassigned, and surviving heavy weapons redistributed. Armored units faced a dual problem. Combat losses reduced numbers, and mechanical attrition created a backlog of damaged vehicles that could not be recovered quickly from mined, shell-cratered ground. German units experienced parallel consolidation, particularly in infantry companies stretched across defensive belts, while artillery units maintained high expenditure rates to prevent Soviet regrouping close to the line. The landscape around Kotluban reflected the aftermath. Fields and shallow ravines were marked by wrecked vehicles, burned-out gun positions, and widened mine belts that remained lethal even when firing paused. Rail stops, hamlets, and farm buildings that had served as reference points in staff maps were repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt as fortifications. For civilians in the wider region, the immediate effects were displacement, loss of housing and livestock, requisitions, and a persistent hazard from unexploded shells and mines that made movement and cultivation dangerous long after the front stabilized. At the higher level, the withdrawal of expectations from Kotluban altered Soviet operational thinking for the Stalingrad sector. The failure to cut the corridor by frontal attacks did not remove the need to relieve the 62nd Army. It redirected the method. The emphasis increasingly moved toward conserving and rebuilding forces for a larger operation aimed at the broader German position on the Don and the supply framework supporting 6th Army. The Kotluban battles thus ended with the corridor still held, the northern armies heavily worn, and both commands preparing, openly or implicitly, for a different type of decision than the one sought in the steppe north of Stalingrad. In the longer history of Stalingrad, the Kotluban battles occupy a narrow window of time but a wide set of implications. They were not a separate campaign with a clear territorial endpoint. They were a series of attempts, compressed into late August and September 1942, to solve an operational problem created by the German corridor to the Volga north of the city. The immediate military outcome was negative for the Soviet side. The corridor was not cut, and the 4 offensives consumed substantial manpower and armoured strength, with aggregate Soviet casualties often summarized at roughly 80,000 killed, wounded, and missing across the cycle. Their first significance lies in what they reveal about Soviet decision-making under political constraint. After Order No. 227, Soviet leadership expected active resistance and demanded offensive action even in unfavorable conditions. In the Stalingrad sector, this interacted with a practical requirement. The city defense depended on time, and time was linked to the ability to prevent German forces from consolidating their northern position on the Volga. The Kotluban offensives show how Stalin's demand for action could align with a rational operational aim, while still producing high tactical cost when the available means and conditions were insufficient for a breakthrough. A second significance is the divergence between tactical and operational logic. At the tactical level, the Kotluban attacks were repeated frontal assaults in open terrain against a defense system that combined mine belts, anti-tank guns, artillery, and air support. Each new attempt began with reduced unit cohesion and fewer serviceable tanks. At the operational level, Soviet command could still regard these attacks as useful if they forced Germany to allocate forces north of Stalingrad and limited what could be concentrated for the assault inside the city. This is the central explanation for persistence. Failure in the immediate objective did not automatically mean the effort was judged irrelevant, because the intended effect included diversion and fixation of German combat power. On the German side, the legacy is linked to resource allocation and risk management. 6th Army held the corridor, but the corridor required continuous defense, counterattacks, and air-ground coordination. Maintaining it meant that German forces had to treat the northern flank as an enduring commitment rather than a solved problem. This contributed to a wider pattern in the Stalingrad battle. German operations were carried out under competing demands, with urban assaults, corridor defense, and protection of the Don flank, drawing from the same finite pool of infantry, artillery ammunition, and air support. The third significance is how Kotluban fits into the transition from immediate relief attempts to the later Soviet operational solution. The inability to rupture the corridor by direct assaults did not remove Soviet intent to relieve Stalingrad. It highlighted that the decisive lever would not be found in repeated attacks against prepared defences north of the city, but in a larger operation aimed at the broader German posture on the Don flanks and the logistics supporting 6th Army. In that sense, Kotluban forms part of the learning curve that preceded the Soviet build-up for Operation Uranus in November 1942, an evolution from urgent, repeated counterstrokes toward a more comprehensive encirclement design. There is also a material legacy for the armies involved. Units committed at Kotluban were shaped by the experience. the need for engineer capability against mines, tighter infantry tank coordination, and the vulnerability of massed armour and artillery to air and counter-battery fires in open terrain. These lessons were not abstract. They were paid for in depleted rifle divisions, damaged armoured brigades, and a constant struggle to restore cohesion quickly enough to conduct another operation. Finally, there is the legacy of memory and historiography. The battles north of Stalingrad are often overshadowed by the urban fighting inside the city and the later encirclement of 6th Army. Yet Kotluban helps explain how Stalingrad became a two-level contest: street fighting at the tactical level, and a broader struggle over corridors, flanks, and operational reserves outside the city. The Kotluban offensives did not deliver their stated local objective, but they remain relevant for understanding why the Stalingrad battle consumed forces on multiple axes at once, and why decisions made under pressure can produce outcomes that are simultaneously unsuccessful tactically and still consequential within a wider operational framework.